Welcome, welcome everyone. My name is Daisy and I'm an organizer for the Party of Socialism and Liberation. I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's event and also to this space, the Indianapolis Liberation Center. At the Liberation Center, we envision a world where the chains of exploitation are not only weakened, but eradicated. In a city and world free from imperialism, white supremacy, and the dehumanizing systems of oppression they uphold, structures of mutual respect, care, cooperation, and justice bind us together. Through the collective joy of struggle, liberation is not only a dream, but a necessity and a reality. We are not here to reform a dying system. We exist to abolish it and build something beautiful in its place. To be a truly liberated space in this city, we can't rely on grants or funding from the very systems we are fighting against. That means our political liberation is dependent on our financial independence. Everything here, the space, the offices, the materials we need to struggle, the costs to fund this place, there's only one place that money can come from, and that's us. We share our home with Answer Indiana, Hope Packages, Arte Mexicano in Indiana, Cultivate, Community Food Box Project, Indiana Black Librarians Network, Focus Initiatives, IDOC Watch, Shaka Shakur Freedom Campaign, and we welcome all progressive and peace-minded people. We are all volunteers here at the Liberation Center, and in fact, we pay to volunteer here. So if you value the work we do, if you want to see us to continue and expand our work and abilities, we ask that you sacrifice what you can. There's no amount too low, and certainly no amount too high. Stephen will pass around a QR code in a bin for cash and cards. So far, the community has sustained this center since October 5th of 2023. And we want to not only sustain it, but grow it. Because our liberated center, oh my goodness, because to be liberated, we need 1, 2, 3, as many liberation centers as we can get, all right? And also, we're excited to announce we're going to be launching a weekly podcast shortly, sometime in the beginning of the summer. We're trying to raise $800 for the necessary professional equipment to do so. So far, we've raised almost $200 and are hoping that after tonight, we can finally purchase what we need so we can get started producing the news and stories our people need. So thank you and welcome again to your city's liberated space. To introduce our featured speaker, I'm going to bring up my comrade Derek. Derek joined the party in 2007, shortly after meeting Eugene, actually. They helped start the Indianapolis branch in 2018 and volunteer as the Organizational Relations Director at the Liberation Center. They also serve on the International Relations Department of the PSL. He's on the editorial collective of liberationschool.org and the coordinator for the Shaka Shakur Freedom Campaign. Please join me in welcoming Derek.
Thank you. I would like to go after Daisy so I can see how much money we can raise. Kind of. But it's always a pleasure to introduce Eugene. I've introduced him many times over the years, and just because when I always date him, of course, but this was like 2007, 2006, and we were both undergrads. I was in Baltimore, and he was at Howard, and he was this was during the height of the anti-Iraq war movement. And we were organizing buses to come to my college, and I knew that this group was serious because they were like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna send people to you to meet with you in your group." And so Eugene and then somebody named Richard Becker came up and met with 20 or 30 of us, and then it was through that experience of going to DC and seeing people like Eugene on stage speaking to like millions of people literally. And seeing how people how can all of this coordination happen? I want to learn how to do that. I don't just want to study history. I'd like to be a part of history and help moving it in the right direction, which is ultimately why I joined. And Eugene's friendship and comradeship has been instrumental along that way. I think he has a mind, that you'll shortly see is singularly, profound in the depth and breadth. Whenever I always just kind of save up random questions that I have, where I don't even know where to start looking for them, right? For when I see Eugene. Because I'll just be like, hey, what was like going on in Ethiopia in like 1924? And I'll be like, well, here's the thing. You gotta say 5 things first, right? And I'll like lay those 5 things out, and be like, you got to read these 2 books, blah, blah, blah. And you really just like, it's quite remarkable. But being smart, of course, isn't like that important, right? It's what you put your intelligence to. And so everything that Eugene, thinks about, does, the journalism is guided towards, liberation and revolution. And so he's a very adept strategist and, a theoretician and a tactician, somebody who's been varied experiences in so many different struggles, are, supplemented by a very deep knowledge of the systems that we're up against, because it's only by really understanding the systems and its various manifestations and the forms that it takes, how it evolves over time, where it is right now, like for example, the state of, racist capitalism or racial capitalism in the US is right now, that we can understand the status and the potential possibilities for Black liberation in our lifetime. And so I'm excited to hear what he says tonight. I mean, I'm always very attentive whenever Eugene starts talking, and tonight will be no exception. So without further ado, please help me welcome Eugene.
Well, I think this is probably good enough. Let's see if we can get a little higher. All right, well, good evening, everybody. I have to say it's an honor to be here, and I want to just thank everybody from the PSL in Indiana and Indianapolis, also, of course, the Indianapolis Liberation Center, and all the member groups for making it possible for me to be here this weekend, I guess today. I don't know how exactly I want to frame that. But, this is my first time in Indianapolis, and it's just, everyone has been fantastic in putting this together and just the hospitality of making it possible. So I just wanted to thank folks before I start my speech about 1924 in Ethiopia. Interesting moment. It's the Empress, actually. Zoichu is the... Anyway, let me not get into that, although it is interesting. But no, I mean, it's interesting. The title was, Our Liberation Can't Wait, something along those lines. And I was thinking on the way here, even though it's not getting a lot of publicity in the media, this is the 160th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which feels like it should be a bigger deal. It's such a seminal event. And that also means, just for the record, it's the 160th anniversary of the 54th Massachusetts assaulting Fort Wagner, which, is what's depicted in the movie Glory, if you've seen the movie Glory. But, one of the great moments, I think, in Black history, and of course one of the most consequential moments with the Emancipation Proclamation. But, when you think about it, it just reminds you of what does it mean to be free. I mean, what does it mean 160 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, you can even have a title that is Our Freedom Can't Wait. 160 years later. You look at, well, another anniversary, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, on Monday, on May 19th, is the 100th anniversary of Malcolm X's birth. And this year is also the 60th anniversary of his assassination. So we're in the Malcolm X centennial. And you think, okay, here we are 160 years from the Emancipation Proclamation. How can we have this title, Our Freedom Can't Wait? It does remind me of what Malcolm himself said, is that you can't have capitalism without racism. Ultimately, the reason why we're talking about why we aren't free is because racism isn't just a state of mind, isn't just a handful of bad people. I mean, it is certainly a state of mind and an ideological view, and it is a lot of bad people. But it's really systemic, and it's deeply systemic, and it's so systemic that you don't even really have to be for it to perpetuate it. I mean, I can't really say, because I don't know him, and I don't know anything about him, I've never talked to him, but you think we've also had the first Black president, Barack Obama. I don't know what's truly in his heart of hearts, but I guess I'd like to think that, he's not racist. That it wasn't like in his mind he's thinking, if I become the president, I want things to get worse for Black people. But nonetheless, you have the first Black president, and things actually, it's always relative, but it seemed to have gotten worse in many ways. At least stayed very bad. I mean, you think about the statistics. Something I often say, and people who've heard me before, I often say that anything that's bad is disproportionately Black. We're 40% more likely to die of diabetes, 2.4% than white people, 40% more, 2.4 times more likely to die of stomach cancer than white people. And that one kind of blew my mind when I looked that up because, I don't know, I feel like when you think of cancer, it's like, it affects everybody, you know, it's just neutral. And I'm just like 2.4 times more likely. And interestingly enough, black infants are 2.4 times more likely to die essentially at birth, you know, before they reach the age of 2. And that's actually the highest rate. 30% more likely than white people to have asthma. I mean, it's really unbelievable. There was a huge thing. You remember Joe Biden was like, we brought poverty down to the lowest level ever. We're the greatest, you know, administration for black people because we brought down black poverty. And the best ever number was 17%, which, by the way, is 6 percentage points higher than the national average. That's the best you can do? We having a celebration over 17%? That's millions of people living in poverty in the richest country in the history of countries. You know, more than 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people, and over 50%, I think it's 52% of all people who are serving life without parole are black. 2.9 times more likely than white people to be killed by the police. And just so you know, 2024 was the deadliest ever year, at least on record, for police murders. So 160 years later, you can't have capitalism without racism. You really have to put those points together because when you look at that level of devastation, it cannot be accidental. It has to be systemic. There's no way that something has lasted this long despite this huge amount of struggle and some progress, unless there is something that is so deep that individuals, even well-meaning individuals in positions of influence, I don't call politicians or anything like having power, because rich people control everything, the ruling class controls everything. But in positions of influence, if there isn't something more deep and more relevant happening here. So it is true that our freedom can't wait, but if we are going to have black liberation in our lifetime, we have to eliminate capitalism, we have to eliminate imperialism, and we have to have a totally new system built from the ground up. And in my view, at least, and I think our view of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, that system is called socialism. Thank you. You know, it's a story that is told a lot of times. You know, I think about the history of capitalism in this country and, you know, how it developed and how it came about and all these different pieces to it. But it is something that I think is worth reflecting on a little bit. I mean, I think you probably believe me when I say that, you know, and when Malcolm X said it, you can't have capitalism without racism. But what does that really mean? And I think it's so critical for us to understand that the foundational reality of this country is based on the expansion of plantation slavery. And I think we also have to put it in its right context, right? Because, you know, you look at what was happening in the so-called 13 colonies, really in the Chesapeake. Most of those colonies were totally failed ventures. The ones in the north were also kind of failed too, but in a different way. But especially in the Chesapeake, it was not working out. It wasn't like they were immediately coming. They were mainly actually dying off, leaving. You know, in Jamestown, actually, you hear everything about Jamestown. Look, this is about to be a crazy year because, you know, we're 250 years this year from the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Next year will be 250 years from the Declaration of Independence. And Donald Trump has directed the National Endowment of Humanities and the National Endowment of the Arts to turn all of their efforts to celebrating the 250th anniversary. But obviously Jamestown's far before that. But we're going to have to hear a lot about Pocahontas, I assume. But, you know, Jamestown was so failed that at one point the people living there were like, you know what? Like, we're just going to leave. Like, we're just going to pack up and leave. And they were, like, on the way out. And then the head of the company that ran Jamestown showed up with more supplies and actually forced them to return because they didn't even really want to return because it seemed like such a failed venture. So it took them a second to get it off the ground. But when you think about how they got it off the ground, and I think this is true sort of all around the sort of broader Caribbean basin, the Americas more largely, it was really drug dealing. And I just think it's interesting we think about that, and I'm sort of fast forwarding to today because we think of how much the war on drugs has been used to demonize the black population in this country, how many people have been forced into the black market economy because they have no other options, and how that's then turned back against you as if, you know, it's just a community of people who hate each other and are, you know, dealing death for reasons that are hard to understand. And when you think about all of that kind of context, I think it's relevant to think this country started in drug dealing. What do I mean when I say that? Is what really made them take off, the colonies in the Caribbean for the European countries and the Americas for the Anglo-American colonies, was tobacco and sugar. That was how they got the whole thing started. Is, you know, Native Americans would smoke tobacco. Sugar was something that had actually come, believe it or not, many things stolen. In the Western world. It's actually stolen from Syria, essentially, where they were already developing sugar. But let me not get off on a whole tangent about that. But they had been trying to do it in Sicily, like trying to grow a lot of sugar, and it wasn't really working out. That's when they went to the Azores off the coast of Africa, and then that's when they started to think more about plantation slavery when they were setting all that up. But, you know, we're also talking about old Europe here, which, you know, the classics. I don't know why I was doing this last night, but I was, you know, scrolling Vivek Ramaswamy's feed. It's interesting. But he went to some private school, and he was like, it's so great that they teach about the classics, you know, and the classics. And I'm into the classics. I like the classics, you know, I like Shakespeare. I'm for it. You know, Aeschylus, I'm for it. I'm with it. You know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, I like it. But, you know, the reason why the drugs took off is that Europe was not a good situation for the average person. So if you could smoke something or put something in your drink and get high, it was like, thank God. People were like wrapped with disease. Like, one of the most interesting things to actually look up is the way the original colonists depicted the indigenous when they got here. And all the images and their writings are like, these people are so beautiful. And they're in such good shape because, you know, they have been eating well, living right, all these other things, while Europeans have been killing each other in these massive wars. You know, you had these waves of disease, people were stunted, pockmarked, had all these problems. You know, you dying at 31 years old, all these other things. So they were actually shocked in what, like, good human shape the indigenous people were in when they showed up. So when you think about just that mental dichotomy, you can see why they wanted to forget some of where they were at. They were also drinking a lot too, which is a whole other issue. That's because water was actually not clean, so you had to drink. But we're talking about, I'm going to get off on so many tangents. We're talking about 250 years since the start of the Americas. I'm not the biggest fan of that Ron Chernow book about Alexander Hamilton that became the terrible play. But the thing that he does go back to a lot in the book, which is very interesting, is the role of alcoholism in the founding fathers, and like how much of what we know of that time, like people were probably doing a lot of these things like dead drunk, and you know, I don't know what I'm taking from that, but it just feels relevant about how we lionize a certain group of people and how we demonize other groups of people. Because when you think about the rise of the police in this country, I mean, so much of it is tied to slavery, but a lot of it is tied to the policing of white ethnic immigrants coming into the major cities who were they're drunk, they're lazy, they're this, they're that. So again, like the things that were fine for the founding fathers have often been turned and used in a moment for the demonization of people over the years to build up the system of policing and mass incarceration. But I just want to go back to the fact that this is what started the country, the foundation of the country in drug dealing. And that's what brings in plantation slavery, because they needed a lot of people to work. And they needed a lot of people to work because they couldn't enslave the indigenous, even though they wanted to. You know, they had tried, but you got to think about, like, these colonies are like right on the coast, like a sliver. So the rest of the continent is all indigenous people. So if you need to run, you can run, and they can't really find you. It's hard to stop them. Then the other problem you had was the indentured servants, the white indentured servants, were not that happy with the situation when they got here, because, you know, they would say, oh, we're going to bring you over, you're going to be free in 10 years. Both indentured servants died before the indenture was even over. And then they would get here, and it was like a virtual form of slavery. So it was nothing like the idea that you could come and then own land, which was the whole piece. You know, that wasn't really working out. People were not liking that. So increasingly, and some of the indentured servants were black. And before sort of major plantation slavery was coming, African descended people were coming from different areas. So you started to have this very, incipient situation where Native Americans, these indentured servants, and the African descended people who were here at that time, started to get together here and there. And, they would build a certain amount of solidarity with each other. They would sometimes run away. We don't talk enough about maroon colonies in the context of the United States, but these are some of you hear about maroon colonies in Jamaica, Brazil, of slaves who would get into the interior and set up their own realities. You have people, white people and black, who were using these networks, maybe an early underground railroad, you could call it, of indigenous people, to get more into the interior and to be able to survive. And labor discipline was just not working out. And then you had another problem, which was that the number of white people coming to the country was starting to dry up for a number of different reasons that aren't really relevant. Well, they're relevant, but I just won't get off on a tangent about that. But so you had a big labor issue. You had a lot of labor. You didn't have as many people coming in as you needed, and the people who you had were pretty restless and weren't really willing to just accept anything. And so what happened is they figured out two things. One, people on the western coast of Africa were the people they need because they had experience in the large-scale cultivation of crops, even some of the same crops that they were growing here in the Americas. And that's something that is, I think, significantly underrated, and why Africa was targeted, like why not China or any other place with a lot of people, is that they deemed these people, a lot of it was racism, like it's hot there and it's hot here, but a lot of it was they had seen that they were growing rice, they were growing indigo, they were growing sweet potatoes, they were growing all forms of food at large scale. They were producing textiles, other things like this. Like, these were not backward societies. These were actually relatively well-developed class societies with, pretty significant divisions of labor in terms of... I'll just hold it. How about that? Pretty significant divisions of labor. So they knew that they could bring them in and kind of immediately slot them into plantation labor, into sort of regimented, large-scale labor systems, because that's what people were coming for. There was also different things happening with the rise of Islam at that time. So there was, discord happening in different ways. So as the Romans said, and as the British would follow, and others, they knew they had a divide and conquer type situation, kind of a best case scenario, divide and conquer situation, to be able to go in and play different people off against each other. So they knew that this was a right population to steal people away from, that they would be able to slot them in, and that they had something that was very, very important, and that was melanated skin. Because that meant if you ran away, you were easier to find. That meant that you was more difficult to blend into the population around you. Now, people have been running away before, but the more people you bring, the harder that becomes. The harder it becomes to integrate in a way that doesn't become relatively obvious, where you can't be tracked down very easily. But nonetheless, they still had to find a way to officially divide people, and to bring divide and conquer in a big way into the system that they had here in the U.S. So what they then decided to do was to bring in a range of laws that would essentially establish a sense of relative privilege based on what you look like. And the people who were going to be at the bottom, the people who were going to be all the way at the bottom were going to be the indigenous people, because they were going to kill them all. And that's, when you look it up, the Anglo-Powhatan Wars in the 1620s and all these other things, these were brutal massacres and genocide, and all the it just was an accident that they got disease. That's not how it went down. It's a great book called American Holocaust. I think everyone should read. That sort of breaks that down. But that's the very bottom. But that of the real workforce, the people they intended not to just genocide out, that African descended people were going to be at the bottom, and that's where they were going to draw the line. So in the 1690s is when actually you start to see the first instances of white as a judicial category coming into government documents in the U.S. And the things that they basically were doing were, there's three sort of main elements of it. One, you couldn't own land if you were black, which is an important issue because some blacks were buying land, especially in Maryland, different parts of the Chesapeake. And so, buying land at that time and even now is really kind of the basis of wealth. So eliminate the ability to build any sort of economic independence. Two, no interracial marriages or interracial sex of any kind. That's going to be illegal. Because the one advantage we have, as I'm saying, is we can kind of identify these people different from anyone else. And we don't want them to have any sort of ability to put any questioning on that, unless you're a slave master. They sort of changed that rule a little bit later. But initially they said no interracial relationships because we got to keep that tight. And three, you can't own guns. I mean, it really is an irony of history in some ways that almost every major instance of huge jumps forward for gun control tend to be really about black control, you know, and the big changes to gun laws tend to happen, you know, really when it's black people potentially rising up for their own liberation. Like, you know, when it's just school shooters, no gun laws. When it's the Black Panthers, stop people from owning guns. And that goes back to the very beginning of this country. So you can't build an independent economic base, you can't defend yourself from racist depredations, and you're essentially being, you know, genetically engineered to be a population that is easier to control in the context of these other factors. So then that really establishes that, I'm talking, this is the 1690s, like the early 1700s, like from the very beginning, the capitalist system was set up to disproportionately oppress black people in this country and keep them locked in the lowest rungs of the economy to make sure that the ability to exploit their labor for the maximum amount of profit would be there in perpetuity. And the results of that are still here today. It's funny because, it's not funny, but you know, everything is relative, right? Like, so I was talking to someone about this with sinners the other day. So I guess I'm gonna give y'all my critique. Yeah, I mean, you know, look, as a technical film, you know, hey, hats off, Ryan Coogler, you did your thing. But I said to somebody, it actually reminded me of the other big film he did, which was Black Panther, where it's like, you would think this was the second coming of Malcolm X, the film. Like, this is the greatest moment for Black America, we have all this is crazy, da da da, and I'm thinking, I'm going in there thinking like, okay, like, hey, like, what's up? Like, what they might do something like big, you know, like this might be radical, this might be, you know, better than Judas and the Black Messiah, which had its own problems, but at least, you know, it had Fred Hampton quote him out, you know what I'm saying? I thought maybe they're gonna have Marcus Garvey show up in the movie, something. Zero politics. So the person I was talking to, I said, listen, I thought it was like a good vampire movie, so I'm not angry at it. You know, if you like those kind of movies, it's high up in the pantheon. But I'm like, it's 2025, and we are happy. And I don't know what is the greater we, right? That's the other thing we have to talk about is how much does the media conversation reflect what black people really think? I don't know. But I'll just go with we because a lot of black people I know personally, so anecdotally, did like the movie. That like the most basic level of representation, that the characters were black and that the storyline was like black people's neighborhoods. That's it. That's it. That is considered a great moment in 2025. And it just lets you know how much this operation of keeping black people locked in the bottom rung really is, that it speaks to such a psychic just pain that black people are facing, that it's like, man, this is huge. They got all black people in the movie. And it's making money. Because that's what everybody was happy about. Oh, we making money. And they trying to say, we don't make money. And I mean, okay, yes, fair. Also good to know in 2025, non-black people will spend $21 to go to the movies for an all-black cast. Like, I guess in a relative sense compared to 1925, that is progress. But in terms of like what we really need to be doing, it actually represents nothing. But the level of representation, which is, as I say, relative, is now so much higher. People actually think things are different than they are. I just looked it up this morning. Black billionaires in the United States are 0.00002% of the black population in America, adult black population. So it's actually lower than that if you include kids. I don't even know what that is. Like, I know like 100,000. When I get to 4 zeros, I don't even know how to say that. Like, it's that small. I don't even know what it's called mathematically. It's just big. So basically, that's it. I mean, you know, there's more you can say, but even if you include like all CEOs and just about all professionals, black people, only about 23% of black people are in all like management, professional, CEO. Like, so there really is no black capitalist class to really speak of. There's a small layer of people who have been elevated by other capitalists to represent aspirationally the idea that the system can save you or that you can work through the system. But that's how powerful this is. This is foundational. This is a cornerstone. This is why you can't have racism without capitalism, capitalism or capitalism without racism. Either way you look at it, I think in that regard, because it's not just sort of an accidental relationship of two things. One is predicated on the other. You had to have this racist national oppression of black people because we are a nation within a nation. Here in the United States, we are a people, and that has to be recognized, that are locked into a system of super exploitation for this system to work, even in 2025. And in 1970, there was a shootout between the Republic of New Africa and the cops in Detroit. And they tried to frame them up as if the cops had raided them. They had to defend themselves with guns. And they went before Judge Crockett's court, and he just let them all go. And there was, interesting guy, very interesting guy. Also was jailed during McCarthyism for defending communists. Then also became the guy who organized lawyers for Freedom Summer in Mississippi. So that's all coming out of this motion of the CIO and that history. But outside of that, every other major progressive wave in the country, however we want to define that, tends to be rooted in black liberation. I mean, Reconstruction and the civil rights movement in its immediate aftermath, and I would say those are probably the two most progressive periods of the country. If you look at what laws were being passed and how things were looking, all of those things were detonated by the struggle of black people. The first time to be free from slavery and to have human dignity, and the second time to address what was stolen from them by the destruction of Reconstruction in the same piece. So you can see over and over again. I think you can say the same thing, honestly, about what we saw in 2020. And not just 2020, 2014 starting in Ferguson. I mean, think about it like this. In the context of what we've seen over the past year, the genocide in Gaza, I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that part of why such a huge solidarity movement was able to arise in the way it did. I mean, obviously people were responding to, just unbelievable situations, but there was already a coterie of individuals who knew more about Palestine. You remember in 2021 also was a pretty big Palestinian solidarity movement during the relatively, compared to this, limited war that happened in 2021. And why is Palestine in 2021, 2022, 2023 more mainstream? Because of what happened in the streets of Ferguson in 2014. Because when Palestinians got online and told people in Ferguson, oh, we see this tear gas, they use this tear gas against us, this is how you fight that tear gas, this then becomes an inflection point moment because people in Ferguson didn't forget that. And RIP to the late Basra Masri, one of the great journalist who was there on the ground, who was a Palestinian brother himself, who recently passed, who was able to break down the Palestinian struggle. And so basically it became, you can't be down with Ferguson if you're not down with Palestine. You can't be down with this new movement if you're not down with Palestine. And a lot of people who did not want to talk about Palestine recognized that if they didn't talk about Palestine, they better not show up in any room of radical black people 2014, 2015, 2016, because we would run them out, because it was going to be about Palestine. Which has always been a long historical event. Don't forget Malcolm X was in Palestine, Gaza in 1964, meeting with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And that SNCC, when it took the very rare position at that time to stand with the Palestinians in the Six-Day War, that was because of a sister named Ethel Minor, who had come up as an organizer under Malcolm X and been educated by those who were around him. But you can see the impact of the Black liberation movement and its ability to sort of detonate struggles of all types all across society to mainstream anti-imperialist politics in a way that is substantial. I mean, even though it's, you can say whatever you want to say. I mean, I would say the NAACP is one of the more sort of conservative groups now in the black community in many ways, in this foreign arms embargo against Israel. So you can see the depths of how this how the struggle of black people in solidarity with Palestinians, because of that incipient moment, was able to create a new matrix of political forces that could move things further. And it's all because the questions that you really start to ask yourself become substantial when you talk about, again, a system that's foundationally based on racism. I mean, when you can't really, you go back and you think of some of these things, 40% more likely than white people to die of diabetes
2.4 times more likely to die of stomach cancer, 2.4 times higher infant mortality of black infants than white, the highest of all races, 30% more likely to have asthma, 17% living in poverty, double the number of people in unemployment, no matter what. Whether the economy is good or bad, it's an iron law of unemployment that black unemployment will be twice white unemployment. Like, you can take that to the bank. So that tells you something right there. Like, that is, no one ever doubts that. And in fact, it's never changed. So when you start to ask questions about why this is, you starting to ask serious questions about the capitalist system. And when you start to ask serious questions, it starts to open your mind about a broad range of things and issues, which is why the Black liberation movement really, in my view, has been the principal vehicle for social justice in general in the United States, and for creating a new and different type of country and government. You know, you think about Gabriel Prosser and Gabriel's rebellion in Virginia, and I'm very proud to be from close to where that was, and I'm very proud to say my county, they were recruiting people in my county for the rebellion, so we were in it. They don't want to give us that credit, we were there. They talk about Thomas Jefferson is from there, true, but Gabriel Prosser is soldiers, we were from there too. But it's interesting to look at Gabriel's whole plan and situation. His plan was very broad, and his vision was very broad, and he actually felt that it would be possible to have a totally new type of society, like not only just getting rid of slavery, but that you would really be able to bring black and white people together. And he actually, or some black and white people, some were gonna have to go, and you know, they planned for that too. But you know, Gabriel was a slave who moved around a lot. He was hired around a lot. And at that time of Virginia, that was like pretty common, especially along the waterways, all because that, you know, there's no railroads really at that time really. And so everything moves on the water, and the draymen, you know, the people who would move the little boats up and down the water, the longshoremen, everybody tended to be majority black. But you would have, you know, whites, especially from other parts of the world and things, that would, you know, gather in these port cities. And Gabriel was a part of this culture where, you know, there was some intercourse between them. And in fact, he recruited 2 radical white Frenchmen. It's an interesting part of the story. No one knows exactly what they were doing there, but it seems like they were a radical part of the French Revolution. And if you know anything about the French Revolution at this time, about 1800, it was pretty radical for a while. It was kind of swinging back, and that they might have just left France, come to the United States, and he had them go out into different parts of the state and start organizing poor whites, and also enrichment. And they had a whole plan, and they figured that if we take the state house, once we take the state house, that then all of the blacks, of course, will rise up, and we get some of these white people to rise up with us. We'll be able to destroy the whole militia, take down the colonial government, and we're going to establish a new government that is based on the universal rights of humanity, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity, as they say in France. And we're going to have like a truly free, truly liberated government, not like how these slave owners are talking, you know, in this revolution. We're going to like do it for real. So, you know, from the very earliest moment, the Black liberation movement acting as a vehicle and a vessel for social justice in general, and also as a portal or a potential portal into a totally different kind of world. And I think we have to give it that level of centrality and that level of importance, because people always want to pigeonhole it. And they want to deny the historical reality and the historicity of the struggle of black people, that it is about really more than black people. It's about the soul and the morality of what is happening here in the continent of North America and what it's really going to be. I mean, we're talking so much now about immigration and the context of it. I wish we could talk more about Mexico as an abolitionist power. And what was the issue with Mexico? Like, why did they need to go in there and take the land? Because Mexico said, you're not going to have slavery in here. We don't believe in that. The second ever president, by the way, of Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, was a black man. And the first ever slave revolt in the Americas was in Mexico. African descended person, African brother who come from Africa, Gaspar Yanga. So Mexico has a deep role in and of itself in terms of the history of African descended peoples in the Americas. But for a variety of reasons, there was not slavery there. And you had these slave owners who had ethnically cleansed the Southeast, right? Like, that's what you hear about the Trail of Tears and Andrew Jackson and all that. Like, what we now know is Mississippi, Alabama, most of Georgia, large parts of Florida, Arkansas as well. Like, all of that was like 1820s, 1830s, totally ethnically cleansed. That is actually what really then becomes the heart of the cotton economy. I almost went off on a tangent about the cotton gin, but I caught myself. And so they're making like a lot of money, and so they figure like, let's just keep going. You know what I mean? Like, we're gonna go through Louisiana, which they already kind of had because the French had already been there. And let's go into Texas. So they just started doing land grabs in Texas, and this is, 1830 something. So it's not like just drones and planes flying around. So you could just kind of show up and kill whoever was there and set up your plantation and do what you wanted to do. But these settlers, Tejanos, they called themselves, increasingly came into contact with the Mexican government that, one, felt like you can't just come in here and just start setting up shop with you're not paying taxes, you're not doing anything. Like, you can't just live here. You got to work with, we are the government. And then on top of that, they're like, and you also can't bring slavery here. So the slave owners who controlled the entire U.S. government at the time were increasingly like, Mexico is a problem. And so the Texas movement is a pro-slavery, pro-genocide movement. In fact, the Texas Rangers, who were founded before Texas was actually a state, 1836, their actual original mandate was to get runaway slaves and to kill Indians, as they would call them then, right? So like the whole project is a genocide, pro-slavery project. They start working with the slave owners and elements of the American government to set the stage to go to war with Mexico. They do go to war with Mexico. They steal Texas. They have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. They steal New Mexico. They steal Arizona, all of that. But the basis of it was that Mexico was inhibiting the expansion of slavery, which was the center of the U.S. economy. And there's a lot of interesting pieces to this. At one time, Mexico and Haiti were actually talking about whether they should combine to invade Cuba and end slavery in Cuba, because they got worried that maybe American slave owners would take over Cuba and use that as a base to attack them. Robert Owen, who people may or may not have heard of, the utopian socialist, actually proposed to the Mexican government to set up a colony of abolitionists on the border with the United States that would fight slave owners. But it never happened because the Mexican government said you have to be Catholic, though. And Owen and his people were like, no, we are Protestants, we're not going to do that. But you can see sort of an interesting history. So again, they want to pit black people and Mexicans against each other. That's obviously one of their main divide and conquer strategies right now. How much it's working, though, I don't really know. I mean, the New York Times actually just asked a direct question in one of the polls of, are you for or against mass deportations? And of the black people they polled, 51% said they were opposed. There's more interesting statistics out there like that. So I think that's also an overplayed point. Like, whatever tensions there may exist, I actually think that there's not a lot of documentary evidence that black people are heavily behind this mass deportations. But I say all that to say, whether it's true or whether it's false, it's obviously a narrative that's out there that people want to put forward. So I think it's important to have the counter narrative of this history and to even go a little bit deeper. After the Civil War was over, the head of Mexico at that time was Maximilian, the Archduke who is Napoleon. All these kings and princes, and I don't know if y'all have seen that, whatever that show is on Maximilian's character on one of those Netflix shows about the Archduke Ferdinand in Austria, and he's the last season. He's like about to go to Mexico, and I'm like, yeah, if only he knew they're gonna hang him because he was like this a pro-French, French imperialist puppet. He was pro-Confederacy, pro-slavery, but he was still hanging on after the war, and so all the Confederates actually start going to Mexico, and that's like where they took the famous Confederate gold, and it looked like they were thinking they were gonna try to like relaunch an invasion into America and restart the Civil War. So the U.S. government sent like tens of thousands of black soldiers to the border of Mexico and basically said, like, if you want to go to war, like, let's go to war. And Maximilian decided, like, that's not a good look. So anyway, he de-escalates in terms of the Confederates, starts to kick them out, but he's still trying to survive. So as they start to disband the United States colored troops, many of the black soldiers then go to actually fight against Maximilian in the army of the, of Diaz, I guess it was at the time. But either way, long story short, to fight on the side of the progressive Mexicans, including, by the way, George Washington Williams, a great figure in African-American history who has many, many superlatives to his name, but notably is also the person who coined the phrase crimes against humanity. And he did that in the context of being one of the people who revealed the crimes of King Leopold in the Congo. So some interesting connections also there between the struggles of African peoples across borders. But anyway, they go into Mexico and they fight with them, and Maximilian is defeated and then killed. So, you know, it worked out. Disappointing for him, but, you know, good for Mexico. Very, very good for Mexico, and good for people who wanted to end slavery. So long story short, you know, you can see that these histories, I think, are important for us to uncover and for us to excavate when we're trying to find a way to push back against these narratives that are against us. And I've gotten off on a long tangent, so let me just close here. You know, the other thing that Malcolm X said about racism and capitalism and the system is he said once that he thought it was, this is 1965, early 1965, it's only a matter of time until capitalism collapses. And the essence of his analysis was that capitalism had been able to survive, really starting with the scramble for Africa by continually expanding across the globe. And as he said, also the famous quote people said, you show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker. And he said capitalism used to be like an eagle and now it's becoming more like a vulture. And that it's going around the world and sucking the blood and destroying every person they can. But because anti-colonial movements and anti-imperialist movements were reaching such a high tide in Vietnam, in Africa and many different places, in Latin America, obviously the Cuban Revolution has already taken place, the Algerian Revolution has happened at this point, Ghana has become an independent country, that because of all of this, that capitalism was running out of blood to suck, and that people were closing down its ability to expand, and from his point of view, it was only a matter of time. So I think if we think about what does Black liberation in our lifetime mean, it means fulfilling the hopes and aspirations of Malcolm X there at the end of his life, who was saying it's only a matter of time, but he knew that things didn't just fall on their own. It's not gravity. You have to build organizations. I actually think one of the most interesting kind of untouched historical issues about the legacy of Malcolm X is the entities and organizations he was engaging with and organizing into networks right at the end of his life. I mean, if you look at what happens in the second half of the 60s, the leadership of the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in 1965 are at Merritt College, and they're talking amongst themselves about how they want to follow and be a part of what Malcolm X is doing. Eldridge Cleaver and Bunchy Carter are actually in prison at that time in California in Folsom, talking about, yeah, Malcolm is it. When we get out, we got to be a part of the Organization of African Unity. In Detroit, the leadership of what would become the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, also working with Malcolm X in conjunction with a number of other forces, the Group on Advanced Leadership. Also in Detroit at that time, the leadership of what would become the Republic of New Africa, also working directly with Malcolm X, the Henry brothers, who become the Okadeli brothers later, working directly with him. You had, you know, giants intellectually, John Oliver Killens, the great Black novelist, John Henrik Clarke, the just, you know, towering Black intellectual. Both of them worked together to help put together the Constitution of the Organization of African American Unity. Malcolm had been in Alabama and Selma, working with forces related to SNCC. He spoke at Tuskegee. He spoke at Brown AME Chapel to radical Black youth. And in fact, the week after he was assassinated, had he not been assassinated, he would be on his way to Jackson, Mississippi to speak at an event organized by SNCC that, at least according to A. Peter Bailey, a journalist who was also very close to Malcolm, was an invitation of John Lewis when they met actually in Africa, when they were both touring Africa to build support and solidarity with the Pan-Africans. And I'll go one level deeper. In 1964, towards the end of the year, Dr. King is having his people, particularly Clarence Jones, his lawyer, call the office of Malcolm X and say, I want to work together on this issue that Malcolm is bringing to the forefront of taking a petition to the United Nations to indict the United States in the World Court over the essentially genocide of African people here in the United States. And it looks like it was actually happening. You got to put the pieces together, but it does look like Malcolm had set it up that the OAU was going to bring him in to speak at the World Court against the United States, and that Dr. King was going to be a part of that motion, and that they were going to work together on this issue of bringing the United States for the United Nations. And the sort of quid pro quo, if you will, is the OAU is asking them to lift up the issue of African liberation to a higher level. So you can see, I can actually go on and on actually about that, but when you put it in that context, it's not surprising they killed him when they killed him, to me. Because you look at all of those different forces coming together, like you just look at what they did 3 years later, all those people, and how it's so iconic, we still talk about it today. Like everyone in every corner of the globe knows the Black Panthers. Like that's how big it was. And you think that was motion that was all under his umbrella. So you can see that Malcolm valued organization over and above anything else. Organizations, alliances, networks that people could not, things were just not going to happen. They could only happen when people come together in profound and powerful ways. And I think if he's right, and I think he is right, that capitalism is right to collapse. It's not just going to randomly fall, but like a ripe fruit, you shake the tree, it's going to come off. But it's only going to happen if we continue to organize ourselves in a serious way. If we recognize that only by bringing together the collective talents and knowledge and experiences of all exploited and oppressed people, that we can actually build a movement that can challenge the capitalist imperialist class. These are the most powerful people on earth. We shouldn't be confused about that. They have all the power. They control all the media. They control the military, the courts, the cops, the politicians. They control most of the preachers. They control most of the imams and the whoever. I don't even know what they call them in Buddhism, but they control them too. They control almost everything. Like money makes the world go round, the almighty dollar, like all those little phrases that we say, and I think sometimes we just kind of gloss over them because it's just phrases that we say are all true. That's why we say them, right? They say every caricature has a kernel of truth to it. And so I think when we think about all these things about money and money makes the world go round, like that is real. So we can't be daunted in terms of what our task really is and who we're up against and how serious it is and how likely that they're going to try to do something serious to stop us. Like we also have to do that. But every movement that's ever succeeded has been infiltrated, repressed, people been killed, put in jail. Like, you can't stop an idea whose time has come. But that only becomes real when you organize to create the agency in the masses that when one person goes down, the next person steps up. I was just recently reading a Soviet novel. Hey, that's me. I don't know, you got Trinity of Fundamentals here?
Yeah.
That's what listen, I'm kind of like a red diaper baby type person. Anybody who comes from like a communist family, he's talking about how he's reading all those old Soviet novels like that. Yeah, that's a part of our culture that I think we have to try to revive and bring back. But Volodymyrsk Highway, it's a good one. It's a very interesting one. Believe it or not, it's required reading in both the People's Liberation Army in China and the Israel Occupation Force training. Because it's a powerful novel about how people come together in battle in ways that you never would expect. So that might make you not want to read it, but I'm just giving you a sense of how profound it is that like those two kind of polar opposite entities feel like, yeah, everyone should read this. But there's a lot of great moments in the novel, but there's a really interesting moment where, I don't know what you guys really know about the Battle of Moscow, so here is another tangent for you, but this is 1941 and Hitler is driving and it looks like he's going to win, he's going to take them out. It looks like Moscow is going to fall, and Volodymyrsk Highway is like one of the main highways that leads into Moscow. So it was very important to defend this highway, and they were like getting close. In fact, there's a famous story about this. It's in The Other Side of the Hill by B.H. Hart Liddell, who is a British guy who went and interviewed all these Nazi generals after the war who were in prison. And they thought they had broken into Moscow. They were like, we made it, we got in, we're in the suburbs of Moscow. And there was an industrial suburb and thousands of workers flooded out of the factories with just their tools and beat back the Nazi war machine. Different area, but that's the mentality, like Moscow cannot fall because everything is open. So in this book, Volodymyrsk Highway, and I'm saying this about how organization lets the next person come up. I don't want to lose you here. The protagonist, who's a commander of a regiment, Kazakh regiment, that is in a tough situation where it's basically like, yeah, we all could die. There may be no other way to slow them down. And he's like in one part of the situation and handling something, lines breaking down, and he's coming back. And as he's coming back to the other part of the line, he sees that the command structure underneath him has totally collapsed. And people are kind of running around. And he's freaking out. He's on his horse, like riding fast, trying to get back to the line. He's freaking out because he was like, the whole thing is just collapsing. And then he starts to see like privates and corporals, like low-ranked people, gathering up everyone around them and at rally points and getting them to fight back. And as he relates in the novel, he says, Even though my whole command structure was breaking down, another force was making it felt at that moment, the Communist Party. That the formal command structure was just one thing, but the conscious individuals who were communists and who hated fascism in the key moment, because they were organized in a party and had discipline and had been working under all conditions for years in this way, were able to step into the breach, reform the military unit, reform the line, and stop the Nazis from breaking through. That's the power of organization. To be able to share the collective experiences, to help us train ourselves up, to share the various skills and ideas we have with one another. So if one person goes down, the next person can step up and they're ready. They're trusted. People understand what's going on. It's something Malcolm X understood. It's something certainly they understood here in World War II in the Soviet Union. It's something that we have to understand very clearly here, and that's what we're trying to do in the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eugene. So we were, two things are going to happen now. So we just got done with a collective study of Eugene's book, Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America, which is the best book on prisons. Just hands down. No competition. And I'm always like, when are you going to write a second edition? And he's like, well, unfortunately, not that much has changed. Other than some statistics. But yeah, no, I teach every semester. So we were hoping to have Comrade Shaka Shakur here, who is actually reading the book. We sent it to him and somebody else, and then they encountered another person reading the book, so they're studying his book together. And then Shaka's book, Collection of Writings, is coming out through 1804 Books by Black August. By Black August, so and Eugene's on the editorial board there, and so they're reading each other's work, and they've been building together, so we wanted to have a dialogue with them. But then Shaka's facility in Virginia, even though it's like a award or whatever, of Indiana, because of the interstate compact, which is like the fugitive slave law, they just kidnapped him and brought him to Virginia. Anyways, he's in lockdown. But we have a pre-recorded message that we're going to set up during this time.
Wow, that's a deep question. Yeah, well, I mean, I think, the form of organization is most relevant to what the goal is, right? And I think that, you really have to prioritize building multiple forms of organizations at the same time, because really the nature of the goals of the struggle are interrelated to the end goal, right? From my point of view, maybe the most core organization is the Communist Party. And why do I say that? Because the Communist Party is really just an organization of working class and oppressed people coming together to get rid of capitalism and to establish a new system, and that system is called socialism. So if that's your end goal, that you have to have a new society, a totally different way of organizing production. What is capitalism in a nutshell? Is that everything is produced for profit, right? If I make a shirt, I don't make it because people need shirts. If I grow food and sell food, I don't do it because people need food to eat. If I build homes, I don't do it because people need shelter. All those things are true, and it makes it easier to sell those things, but I will not do them if I cannot make money. That's what it comes down to. And that's why, for instance, we talk about housing, there's never enough housing for poor people, because it is not profitable, really. In some ways it is, but that's why it's only a small number of slums and slumlords and things like that. But by and large, it's not that profitable to build enough housing for everyone to be in there and to actually sell it for the amount of money that people can really afford. And I think you could say that about so many other things. Socialism is really just the opposite of that, right? It's saying you have a certain amount of human and material resources in the world, and that what you need to do is, instead of thinking about how to exploit those for a tiny number of people to make profit, how do we come together collectively and say, what do we have, what do we need, and what do we want, and then put those three things together. Take what we have and then put it towards what we need first and foremost. You think Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people have heard about that, the most basic things you need as humans to survive. Then you say, based on what we need, what we have, what do we want, and out of what we still have, what can we get that we want? And then when we say, are there things we want that we cannot reach, how do we organize those same human and material resources, what we have, to set up a plan for how we can get the things that we want that we can't get immediately, right? So it's just a total flip, going from profit first to people first. So that requires a certain type of organization that is made up of, to use a sort of fancy term, what some people call the revolutionary subject, right? The people most likely to revolt against capitalism. And that's the people whose very existence, or the negativity of their very existence, is based within the system itself. So workers, of course, people who have no other choice but to go to work in order to survive, and oppressed peoples who have the same enemy, right? The imperialist ruling class, even if not all of them are workers per se. So that's part of the question, but there are a lot of things that have to happen to make any sort of revolution, as we talk about. And most revolutions are made out of a multiplicity of smaller struggles, sometimes limited struggles. Lenin actually used to always make this point on a regular basis that something can seem small but actually be deeply revolutionary if people feel extremely angry about it. So even small outbreaks of struggle around, non-economic issues, they used to call them in Russia at that time, like there was a big strike of students in the 1890s and all the Bolsheviks were like, oh man, we do workers. We're not worried about those students. And this is Russia in the 1890s, so students are all very rich and very privileged. Like, you think Harvard is rich and privileged? It's like 20 times that. But for a lot of reasons they were revolting. I won't get into that now. And he was like, no, we got to support the students. Because the students are angry at how terrible the czarist dictatorship is, and the czar is our number one enemy. So anything we can do to build up the resistance of people against the czar is going to help us. So they were building up a lot of different types of organizations, student unions, student organizations. In the same way, we have to build up organizations to fight against police brutality, to fight for housing rights, to fight, for the rights of those who don't have homes, to fight for those who are living and afflicted by hunger, for those who need health care. Like, we have to have organizations that are not just, we can have a lot of different views about capitalism in those organizations, right? But we can have at least one view that this particular problem or set of problems is in fact so odious we have to struggle against it, and we can unite on that basis. So the level of unity, in a way, is not as consistent. We can have more disagreements, but we have to be able to build those kind of mass organizations that can help us push the fight back. We have to build cultural organizations and institutions, because part of what we're doing, and some of those, I think if we're doing it right, should be tied to our parties and to our mass organizations. Like, we should all have cultural wings and ways of organizing these pieces, because we're deeply in a battle of ideas and emotions. And I would say, based on where we are right now, that's the most important battle. Because, you think about this stage, the New York Times, why am I quoting the New York Times so much? They did do a poll last summer I thought was useful. They asked people, do you think the economy should be majorly transformed or totally torn down? And 69% of people said it should be majorly transformed or totally torn down. 78% of black people said that, by the way. You can look at the fact that, like, Trump, okay, he's the president, Republicans control everything, but interestingly enough, Trump only won about a third of the people eligible to vote. So not even the people of the age to vote. So in fact, the entire MAGA movement, even though it controls the whole government, is actually a minority movement. And if you look issue by issue, almost all of their issues only have minority support. So I say all this just to say, like, there is a huge amount of anger, discontent, frustration, despair, hopelessness, like all these other emotions that are out there in relationship to our society, because people feel like something is broken and something is wrong. But what are you going to do about it is the question. And for a lot of people, it's nothing. A lot of people are so beat down, they just figure, I'm just going to keep my head down, man. I'm just going to grind. I'm just going to try to get through it. I'm just going to try to find whatever I can find, You look at, when I did Shackled and Chained, I did some research, and I wanted to say, what does the government say about why people do drugs? And I didn't know what they were going to say. I'm like, White House, I went through there like everybody else. I'm thinking like, whatever. And of course, though, but the list actually was a pretty good list. It was like, number one, people have problems and they want to escape from their problems. Like, true. And number two is that people are bored. And I thought that is like a pretty deep statement that even the government is admitting that the crisis of addiction all across the country is essentially rooted in the fact that tens of millions of people's lives are just terrible to live every day. And for even the people who are making it, quote unquote, life feels so soulless and lacking in substance, they still feel the need to escape. So we're in a deep battle of ideas and emotions if we want to win. And if we think about how do we move people into struggle, like right now, people are mainly moved into struggle both spontaneously and inconsistently. Like George Floyd, it was bad, no doubt about that. But look, a lot of us in here, we've seen some bad videos before where people didn't rise up like that. And there's also situations like Sean Bell, which was a big, people might remember that back in 2005, which swept the country. There was no video, but it's still just the story of it was so bad, people did things. So how do we move people into motion more consistently? We have to wage the battle of ideas and change what's in here and help people push back against the narratives that they don't face all the time. Like, why is social media so popular? Because everyone tells you you have no voice and you do not matter. And social media, as bad as it is, the reason why it works is because it gives you a voice and it gives people a way to interact with you that affirms the fact that you do matter and that you do have a voice and that large numbers of people agree with what you have to say. So we're in a situation where we have to really find ways to help people push back against the propaganda, but also to empower them to speak on their own behalf. And I don't know where I'm going with your question, but we talk about the types of organizations. I just think building in culture, building in media, building all those things is, in a way, almost more important than all the other tasks. Because until we can get people to drop those mental shackles, there's nothing you can do. Stephen Biko said that about the Soweto uprising. He said that the reason, because the whole Soweto uprising was just about language in school. And they said, instead of learning in your language, we're going to teach you in Afrikaans, the language of these racist apartheid, slave masters. And these young kids, they were young kids, some of them were in elementary school, literally. Hector Peterson, who was killed, very young man. There's the famous photo from Soweto of his friend carrying him. But they rose up, and he said that, when they rose up, there were shackles taken off their mind that nobody could ever put back. And he was right, because that was a turning point in apartheid, and it only got worse for the apartheid government after that. And the mass struggle only got bigger after that. So you have to free people's minds in a real way. So maybe that kind of answers your question, but maybe we want to go to the message here.
Yeah. I don't know why I'm trying to.
Yeah. It's okay.
You gotta. Is it sound?
Yeah, you want me to turn the fan off?
Yeah.
Oh.
Basically, Rand, we was talking about the continuity of national liberation struggles and the need for continuity, but also the need for education and internalization of an ideological line or political line to really understand that struggle that goes beyond just the rhetoric, or revisionist history. And it's important for people today, particularly younger people, to do their due diligence, and investigate those movements and that legacy and the sacrifices that's been made. Like I was saying before, do you know that in the 90s, I think it was, that Bill Clinton pardoned something like 13 to 15 Puerto Rican revolutionaries that was independistas, those that had been fighting on behalf of bringing independence and national liberation of Puerto Rico. Do you know about the Macheteros? Do you know about the BLA and this other units and whatnot that was engaged in expropriations of finances in order to support the movements? You might know about Tulu Shakur, you may know about Sekou Odinga and so forth, but do you know the actual struggles and activities that them brothers was involved in and the sacrifices that they made? In the anti-imperialist movement, or the Ohio 7, the Thomas Mann, and Lemon, and all them brothers and sisters that supported national liberation struggles, and that wasn't just about rhetoric, or posturing, or functioning within the parameters of the state of legality, where they was putting their ass on the line, their freedom on the line, and their life on the line to support those movements and those struggles, And so this is why I always say that we need to introduce to a new generation of activists and up-and-coming revolutionaries the history of the New African Independence Movement. You understand? So that you understand when we talk about New Africa, the Republic of New Africa, and land and self-determination, it's not an abstract idea. You know, when you're talking about support for Palestine, you know what I'm saying, and what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in the West Bank, which we all support and show love and loyalty for, but do you understand what the hell is going on down there in Mississippi? You understand? Do you know what's going on in Alabama with the lynchings that's still continuing, that don't get no news coverage? You understand? Do you know what's going on down in Louisiana with the cop killings and so forth, and the railroad to the prison industrial complex, and how this also represents genocide? You know, and so while we talk about and support international solidarity, we in the heart of the beast. You must also understand and recognize the intersectionality of national liberation struggles and oppressed nations within the U.S. empire. You know, and domestic colonialism and neo-colonialism, like what does that really mean in practicality? Outside of just the definition, you understand, of colonization. You know, what does that look like in reality in terms of being able to put food on your table, in terms of trying to get health care, in terms of being safe in your community from being killed under the color of law? You understand? Or having your child waved to adult court and sent to the penitentiary as a kid for life sentences or death row. What does that look like? You see what I'm saying? So you have to put things in that context of struggle and so forth. And when you start to understand the attacks on the state and by the state from back in the day of these previous movements in terms of infiltration, you understand, in terms of criminalization, in terms of trying to delegitimize, you will understand and see the pattern that's repeating itself when you see them charging ones with federal crimes of RICO for participating in anti-cop city activities. You understand? When you see them attacking church charities that's raising funds or doing support work or donations as supporting terrorism. As you see Trump now talking about exiling U.S. prisoners to foreign countries and foreign jails, you understand? When they actually get that shit operational and structured, who you think they're going to be targeting in these prisons? While you talking about political prisons, support for political prison POW, who you think they're talking about sending the exile to these foreign countries and away from our support base, you understand, and movements and so forth? You know, I'm sitting in the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth of Virginia, from Indiana, kicked out of Indiana and domestic exiles for my political organizing and so forth, you understand? And that's just out of state, per interstate compact, you know? So imagine, and I'm still active, you understand? And I'm still having laid down, and I'm still putting in work, and I'm building bases and operations and structures where I am. So they ain't stopped nothing. So what does that say? Okay, well, that ain't work, so what's the next step? You know, so it's real. You know, so I just want to push that out there in terms of continuity. And with that being said, we want to push the idea that we have to get better centralized, not centralized in terms of authoritarian politics, but centralized in the terms of we are talking to one another and we are organized amongst one another and we are coordinating amongst one another, you know, regionally, nationally, locally. You know, and we are building those networks and those infrastructures to support one another through mutual aid and other resources, you know. Peace.
Okay, perfect. We'll just go one at a time. This is about NATO. With the upcoming action against NATO, could you talk about NATO's role in U.S. imperialism and how the struggle against imperialism relates to Black liberation? I guess I'll just start with the last part. The struggle against imperialism relates to Black liberation in the sense that I just sort of said it, right? You can't have capitalism without racism. Because what is imperialism? Imperialism is just capitalism on a worldwide scale, right? It's the internationalization of monopoly capitalism, to use a real direct term. But basically, imperialism is just capitalism was developed in a small handful of countries, then they went to the rest of the world, took it over, and exploited those nations and others. So in the same way, the enemy of Black liberation really is this system of capitalism that was created on our backs, and really we can't address any of our issues without addressing that system. It's the same people, the same ruling class, the same entity. So the struggle right here for Black liberation is a struggle against imperialism. And I think we have to think about it like struggles against imperialism aren't just in some foreign country, they're also right here. I mean, Shaka made that point, you're in the belly of the beast. And his point echoes Che Guevara's statement to American revolutionaries that he was jealous because they had the most important task on earth. So really the struggle against imperialism is all of our struggles against the ruling class oppressors. So it's direct and irregardless of anything else, the struggle for Black liberation is, and has always been, really the tip of the spear of the struggle against imperialism in the country. I mean, I don't want to go off on a whole long tangent, but you think about the Vietnam War, you can think about so many different aspects, the movement against the Spanish-American War, the occupation of Haiti in different times, like for sure, the Black liberation movement has been a key vector. The only mass market publication that is anti-imperialist in the United States is probably the Final Call, the Nation of Islam newspaper. Like mass market, tens of thousands of people reading it every single day, every single week in a consistent way. So again, speaks to the same point. But to say all that, NATO is also an expression of imperialism. And so, you talk about linking and bringing struggles together. I mean, NATO's role, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The first thing you should think about is this was the same entity they used to invade Afghanistan after 9/11. Afghanistan is nowhere near the North Atlantic. 2 years ago, they were like, NATO, we're going to China. We're pivoting to Asia. Asia, definitely nowhere near the North Atlantic. So, when they went to Libya and destroyed Libya, and then look at they're trying to send immigrants to Libya, and they say they're going to send 1 million Palestinians to Libya. And the only reason they can do that is they destroyed Libya, broke it apart, but this has become like a hell on earth. I mean, slavery has reemerged, slave markets in Libya, but the agency they use to do that, NATO. So something should just tell you right there, if they in Libya, Afghanistan, and the Pacific Ocean, it's maybe not about the North Atlantic, and it's probably not defensive. NATO, the easiest way to think about NATO is NATO was created to integrate the remnants of the old European colonial empire's military power into a structure controlled by the United States to create a very significant, large army to pressure, counter, and potentially go to war with the Soviet Union. And I don't want to go on a whole long tangent here, but everything you've been told about NATO is fake. And when people say, oh, Trump going after NATO, well, look, even the stopwatch is right twice a day. Like, he's right on that one. Like, we got to get rid of NATO, get out of NATO, stop NATO, because the whole point of NATO was to keep war tensions alive in Europe. Because after World War II, people in Europe did not want to fight. But the other thing is they also wanted to have governments that were, more progressive, that might have some communists and socialists in it, some, Christian Democrats they called themselves, and, liberals, different people to have, kind of just to set things up in a way that would represent the trends in society more democratically. And they wanted to work together, with other European countries, also with the Soviets, and to have no war. But for the United States, this was an existential crisis. They write about it in their own documents. There's a secret document around the time NATO was being created about the reunification of Germany, because some of y'all may know Germany was divided after World War II. And it was like a secret document at the time, no longer secret, and it was a top U.S. official saying, yeah, our biggest problem is we're telling everybody publicly that we don't want a divided Germany, but we actually do, because this is actually key to stopping peace breaking out in Europe. If Germany is allowed to reunify with no military on a peaceful economic basis, they're going to get together with France, with Italy, with all these other countries, and they're going to think, wow, the Soviet Union, big country, a lot of power, a lot of economy, let's work with them too. And then that would mean that the US would have no influence really in Europe, a limited influence in Europe, and that what they really wanted, which was to dominate what we call the global South, would not be possible. Because the European colonial empires were collapsing. And the number one support for the anti-colonial movements was the Soviet Union. And so if the Soviet Union became more powerful, and if the European nations sort of managed their own process of decolonization in conjunction with the Soviet Union, it would mean that the way these countries in Africa and Asia would emerge, they would want to sort of set their own rules about how they interacted with the United States, which is the preeminent economic power in the world. So they created NATO to prevent peace from breaking out, to create a permanent tension in Europe between what we now call Russia, then the Soviet Union, and Western Europe and the United States, so that they could militarize the European continent and increase their own military spending under the guise of the Cold War in order to be able to, if not wage more active wars, at least prevent an uncontrolled decolonization process in the global south, and to prevent progressive forces from being elected democratically in Western Europe that would make their profit making impossible. So they created NATO, and they said, we're defending ourselves against the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union said, hey, could we join NATO? Because we want peace. And they said, nah, you can't join NATO. So they created it, they lied about it, they've branded it as defensive, and they've used it ever since as a major tool of warmongering. So it sits right at the heart of the imperialist war machine, and that's why we have to oppose it. Oh, wow, this is good. I like that. Synergy, segue. How can we move towards the next upsurge of global revolution? And what do you think Black people's role in that movement is or will be? Well, some of it, I think we're already kind of moving in that direction just by getting organized and getting involved and taking action that's naming the need for revolution, right? Like every upsurge in revolution always starts with people, I wish I could remember that Gandhi quote, the first they laugh at you, then they ignore you kind of thing. Like it actually always starts with relatively small movements and relatively small groups of people just helping frame for people like, this is why the solution to all your problems is revolution. And anyone who has done revolutionary work for a long time, sometimes you really do feel like you're standing on a street corner ranting and raving, like you're just out of your mind, because people are like, what are you talking about? Revolution, like that's crazy, it's America. But nonetheless, that's how it always starts. And so I think we've already taken the first step, but I think the next step is what's gonna move towards that. So organizing is what moves us towards this. I guess maybe here's the better way to frame it. If you look at revolutionary movements, 9 times out of 10, the things that really kick them off in a mass sense where tens of millions of people get involved are not actually created by revolutionaries. Revolutionaries come to power and succeed and win in revolutions because when events that are outside of their control take place, they are organized in such a way that they can take advantage of the decay of the existing society, right? Like there's a quote about when revolutions happen, and the quote is, that happens when the rulers can't rule in the old way and the people can't live in the old way in a conscious sense, like they won't live in the old way, right? So that means that different things have to happen. So the question is, are you going to be ready when those things actually come towards them? So it's the process of, I've quoted Lenin a few times here, I hope that's okay here at the Party for Socialism and Liberation, but he talks about how strikes and mass movements and protests are the embryos of the real class struggle, which is when all working class and oppressed people consciously take on as a unit all of the people who are exploiting them. And you have to have those struggles, you have to have those strikes, you have to have those fights, you have to be able to develop the muscle and the militancy and the organization and all of that. And it starts with, small meetings in relatively small rooms to put yourself in a position. But I do think that there are a lot of different things. What is Black people's role in that going to be? I think it's going to be a big role in a number of different fronts. One, I think Africa is going to play a major role in the destruction of capitalism on a worldwide scale because, Africa is the youngest continent. You look at a place like Niger that has just had this military popular uprising along with the Alliance for Sahel States. Something like 42% of people in Niger are under the age of 15. And I can tell you, I've traveled all over the African continent. At basically every African country, it's like 70% under 30. Sometimes it's even higher than that. And Africa, of course, is probably no place more under the boot of imperialism. Like all the poorest countries, by and large, many of the worst deprivation that you can see. But you can see amongst young people in Africa, and I can tell you, I really have been all over Africa, and this is so true. People love what is happening in the Sahel, in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Like they are more popular. Like Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, he could win an election in every African country, like right now, guaranteed. People love what's happening there. Because you have a generation of people who have seen their parents and their grandparents, sometimes their great-grandparents, because it's a young continent, live multiple generations with no access to opportunity in abject poverty under the boot of these foreign countries, and people just aren't going to take it anymore. That's what the Gen Z uprising was about in Kenya, for sure. You see what happened in Senegal, where they were able to sweep away a government and bring in the current Prime Minister, President Diomaye Faye. People are behind that. So I do think that Africa and the struggle of African people against neo-colonialism and this is, I don't have a crystal ball, but this is just what I feel from my own research and what I've seen on the ground, I think is going to be the tip of the spear of the next, it actually already is the tip of the spear of the next global wave of revolution, but I think it's going to be right at the center of what happens, because Africa is the #1 economic center of Europe. So if Africa can flip its sovereignty, Africa will control Europe. And if Africa controls Europe, that will change the whole world in ways that are hard to predict. And I think here in the United States, it's tough to say, but I think the role of Black people has always been to be the vanguard force driving the country forward. And I did this whole rant, maybe some of y'all saw on Breakthrough News, about people saying Black people shouldn't get involved in protests, and people say, you people want to send us out here because we dying? We doing all the dying anyway. So at the end of the day, I would rather be, as Claude McKay said, dying for something. If we're going to die, let us die standing up like men, not cornered and backed up against the wall and slaughtered like hogs. Like that, I think, is the mentality from Gabriel Prosser to Nat Turner to Malcolm X to the people in Ferguson to the people in Baltimore to the people in Minneapolis. Like, that's the mentality. Like, we already dying. We already, as the last poet said, we already dead. That's the mentality. A lot of times when you wake up, you don't know if you might come home that night. So I think that Black people will continue to be, the key agency. I don't think there could be any revolutionary movement in the United States where the key leadership and the key motion will not start in the Black community, perhaps amongst Indigenous people as well. I think we saw that with Standing Rock, which had a unique moment in the context of climate change. But those two things, genocide and slavery, are closely twinned, and they tend to move together as well in different ways. But I think that the Black liberation movement will continue to play that role and continue to push it through. And I think from Ferguson to 2020, that has been the most vital revolutionary force in the past 10 years. So I think we have to learn from that just immediate history and assume that some similar replay of that will be what brings us forward. Yes. Well, this is a good question. It's a long question, but it's about the establishment of whiteness as a judicial category and the relationship between the judicial whiteness and sort of the assumption of whiteness, right? The sort of how people, ethnicities who were considered non-white then became white, like the Irish. There's a good book, How the Irish Became White, about this issue and how were they assimilated. Does it have its roots in anti-Blackness or the accumulation of capital? And I kind of feel, and related to that, is it impossible to be a capitalist and pro-Black? And that's a great, yeah. I kind of feel the two are kind of twinned together, the anti-Blackness and the accumulation of capital, because, the basis of white supremacy as a concept and the judicial rise of Blackness was not just like, in the abstract, you are better than others. It was in the concrete, we are setting up a relatively better position for you. And we are putting you in a position where your relative privilege as compared to slaves, and then subsequently Black people, will only be maintained in a system of white supremacy, which I think reinforces a mentality inside of white people and the white community, such as it is, that they are existentially threatened by Black freedom. Now, you could make a case, and it would be true, that they are in fact not existentially threatened, because the whole context of relative privilege is that you too are also being oppressed and exploited, but all life is relative. So you can talk about something in the abstract, but if in the here and now, this is the basis of why you can say, well, compared to then, I'm doing well, and I ain't trying to be over there like that. Like, you think about Monroe County, North Carolina, where the famous kissing case happened, where Robert F. Williams, who wrote the book Negro with Guns, took up arms to counter the racists, to integrate the pool. The pool was called the Monroe County Country Club. But you should look it up. It was not a country club. Like, the pool, it wasn't even really that nice. And I the first time I saw a picture of it, I was like, damn, like, that's what they were fighting to defend? But if you were Black, there was no pool. So it's hot in the summer. And you a kid, you want to go swimming, right? So the relative privilege of saying, this is the system that allows my kid to be able to swim in the summer. Like, that's a powerful impulse that over generations becomes deeply embedded in the mind and the mentality. So I think the issue of the accumulation of capital and anti-blackness as a concept are sort of intertwined with one another, because the construction of a system of white supremacist privilege, which just gives you this existential hatred of black people, I think is tied to that. And I do think, yeah, it's impossible to be a capitalist and be pro-black. You can pretend like Jay-Z, right? But like, remember when Colin Kaepernick went in and Jay-Z was like, yo, I'm sorry, we got kids in here. I don't F with the NFL. I'm never doing anything with the NFL. Jay-Z now has a massive multi-million-dollar partnership with the NFL managing the Super Bowl halftime show. And, you know, I don't know if y'all been checking for the Super Bowl halftime show, but it's not radical. And again, like I was saying about sinners earlier, it's the same thing with Kendrick Lamar, and I like Kendrick too. But people acting like Kendrick Lamar in the Super Bowl is Huey Newton showing up with a shotgun, you know, on the street. Like, what is this? Like, so it's a pretend faux pro-black, and like I said, is of black billionaires is 0.0000002% of black people. But they've lifted up this small category of people to try to create this sense. But look at how all the rich black people is all liquor and gambling. Like, I mean, I don't want to get into the Diddy trial issue, so I'm not. But like, how did Diddy actually go from just like an impresario to like a really rich dude? It was when he set up the Diageo situation. Jay-Z was the same thing. When he really like went to a new level because he had a liquor partnership. You look at Kevin Hart, I see Kevin Hart on every gambling commercial. And I don't know if y'all like sports, but if y'all like sports, you see how it's going crazy with the gambling. Why is every gambling commercial all black people? Like, that should tell you something. So they have created this whole idea that this lifestyle blackness of black excellence, which is actually predicated on the most destructive industries for black people, the music industry, the liquor industry, and the gambling and the lottery. Like, that should tell you that being a black capitalist, you're not pro-black. Like, it's just not possible. You can think you are, you can feel like you're doing something for the community, but realistically, if we're about black people, all 40-some million of us, being pro-black is lifting everybody up. I'm not getting one check from Kevin Hart's liquor deal. Caesars is not paying me. Not that I want to be paid, right? But like, we get nothing from that. And in fact, you could argue that we get only negativity from it. So I think we have to really be clear if we're going to lift up black people as a people. I mean, I listed all those things. 40% more likely than whites to die of diabetes. Black infants 2.4 times more likely to die than white infants. Black people 2.4 times more likely to die of stomach cancer. 30% more likely to have asthma, 55% of the people who are doing life sentences without parole, 2.9% more likely to be killed by the police, 2 times more likely to be in prison, double the unemployment in all circumstances, good or bad. I mean, how are you going to deal with all those problems under capitalism? A system where profit comes before anything. Like, if you really just take a second, think about it tonight, and try to walk through in your mind how you can solve all of those problems. And if you can tell me a way to solve all those problems without hurting the pockets of capitalists, please write me, because I've been wrong for 20 years. And let me know what it is. It's not possible. I mean, you look, I was talking about black billionaires. Serena Williams is a billionaire. Married to a billionaire, I guess, but very rich person herself. And remember when she had the issues with childbirth? And she was like, I'm one of the richest people on earth, and they still didn't believe me. So if the medical system is so racist that even one of the richest, most privileged black women on the planet Earth can't get a doctor not to treat her with extreme racism to the point where her life was in danger, then that should just let you know right there to take control of the healthcare system and deal with infant mortality and black maternal deaths. Like, we're going to have to take the power out of the hands of the insurance companies, the private hospitals, the private doctors, the private medical schools, actually the school system in and of itself. People say we're competing with immigrants for high-tech jobs. Who? Where? We're not even prepared for the job. In 3rd grade, they already decided you can't code. And they tracked you into something else. That's why we were talking about that earlier. That's why some of the time they plan how they grow prisons based on the test scores. When Rahm Emanuel in Chicago closed down all those schools, and people said, how can you close down all these schools in poor neighborhoods? He said, let's be real, 1/3 of them never going to graduate anyway. That's their mentality. So you think you compete, you're not competing, you're not even being prepared at the most basic level. So to even address the most basic affirmative action, which we should be doing in the high-tech industries, like you would have to actually have a totally different educational system. So I just think it's important that we think in a big way about what capitalism really is, what it really means, and what it really means to have a group and collective uplift, what collectivity could look like, and we talk about that in a real way because, like I said, we're in a battle of ideas and emotions. And insofar as Kendrick Lamar at the Super Bowl, Sinners, Black Panther, and all of that can be considered like an excellent representation of blackness, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. That means that they still control the narrative. Because realistically, in 2025, how is it possible? Like, there is one movie about Nat Turner, and that movie got crushed and never really got wide distribution. Nothing about Gabriel Prosser. I guess you got Judas and the Black Messiah, but that has its own contradictions, right? Kind of humanizing an FBI agent. Like, how can we not have one movie that's just like purely like, yeah, like we did it, you know what I'm saying? Like we were radical, we rose up, we were intelligent, we were organized, the world was loving us. Like we can't just have one without any blemishes. Like one just radical black movie without any blemishes. Nothing to complain about. Like nothing I can get on, I mix what I like with Jared Ball and hate on. Like something I just have to unequivocally like. In 2025, like that is crazy. And we have to really think about what that means about the narratives that are being created by the so-called privileged individuals among us. And I guess I would include Barack Obama in that too, and the idea of ascension. And I guess I'll just close on this. Influence and power are not the same thing, and that's the biggest problem for politics in America. Everyone equates influence with power. Politicians are influential, not powerful. Because politicians can only operate in a certain framework. And you step outside that framework, you're not going to be in that seat. Look what happened to Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. And they weren't even saying that much, right? So power, as Huey P. Newton said, is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in the way in which you desire. That's why Marx says that capital isn't money, it's a social force. Because if you have capital, it's not just having money in your pocket. Having capital means you decide who works, when they work, where they work, for how long, for how much, under what conditions, if they work or not. You control their whole life. That's the power of capital. I mean, I was talking about how you make everything you make clothes. The thing I always ask people when I ask them to think about capitalism is, why do you have the style that you have, right? Because almost nothing is more personal to us than our style. What we wear, like that is so personal. And you feel like you really are shaping the style. But when you went into the store, like there's only a certain amount of clothes in the store. When you turned on the TV and saw people with different styles, well, you didn't decide whether skinny jeans were in or out, right? It was just one day they were in, next day they were out. Even if you have a totally countercultural style, you're like, I'm against all of that. Well, you still got the clothes from somewhere. So even if you mix it and match it at the flea market thinking I'm really doing it, well, that means that you just got the second hand of the capitalists who have already decided there's going to be a certain range of clothes and styles, and everybody got to fit in. Like, that's how deep they control our lives at an individual level. And we have to really understand that influence and power are not the same thing. It's the biggest problem in the labor movement right now, for sure. People think if they listen to you, that's power. If they listen to you, that's influence. Power is control. So until you can say we collectively are going to decide whether the skinny jeans are in or out, and how they get made, and where they get made, and if they get sold at all, for how much money, right? Like then we have power, collective power, just like capitalists have collective power. Anything like that is influence. Now you need influence, for sure, because that's how you leverage your potential power, right? Like that's why they give you influence, because you have leveraged your potential power to challenging those who actually have power. So building influence is part of the power building process. But having influence is not the same thing. And all of the vote for the Democrats and the Democrats care more about your issues, are going to promote that. That's all about influence, which you don't have any of because they don't care about your issues. Just look at what they did in the last 4 years. Look at what they did, as Shaka was saying, under Clinton. He was one of the most anti-black presidents we ever had. People ever heard of Ricky Ray Rector? Ricky Ray Rector was on death row in Arkansas because he had killed a sheriff's deputy in 1981. And after he did it, he was pretty distraught. and so he tried to kill himself. But he did not succeed, and he basically lobotomized himself, and he ended up having, IQ is also kind of a racist concept, but basically, he was kind of at the level of like a 6-year-old, and he had other problems. They used to call him the chicken man in the prison, because he would make animal sounds and things like that, and he didn't even have the most basic awareness of where he was and of anything like that. And Clinton leaves the campaign trail to execute Ricky Ray Rector. Couldn't even remember what he did. And, when they brought in the last meal, the pie part of it, he got some pie put aside, and the chaplain came to give him his last rites. He said, "Aren't you going to eat the pie?" And he said, "Oh no, I'm saving it for later." So he didn't even know what it meant. But Clinton flew back from the campaign trail to execute him to show I'm tough on crime. Basically, I'm going to kill those niggas. And you better believe it. That's what he meant, and that's exactly, he meant the same thing that Reagan meant when he said, "I'm going to start my campaign in 1980 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where they murdered those civil rights workers." You don't have to say the N-word to mean it. And you don't do something like that unless that's the message you're sending to these racists of who you really are. But people then say he's the first black president. Right. Now I'm 39, I can remember it. He went on Arsenio Hall and played the saxophone. And people say, "Oh, he's playing the saxophone, he smoked weed, he did this and he did that. Isn't he for us?" And he's executing Ricky Ray Rector and ramps mass incarceration up to levels that Nixon and Reagan never could have even imagined. So how much influence did you really even have? And you certainly didn't have any power. We have to understand the difference between influence and power if we're going to build a movement to win. And so many people are trying to sidetrack us into different forms of organizing that, yes, may gain influence, but that are deliberately designed to prevent us from having power. If you just get in the Democratic Party, it's going to work out. If you just get in Congress, it's going to work out. But all of those institutions are designed to limit your ability to exercise power. Like the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, the Takings Clause. So you can't expropriate a capitalist unless you pay them, technically. They did not do that in a lot of ways after slavery, so there is a precedent for that. But if you think about some of the statistics I just raised, and you think about having black people having 30% more likelihood of having asthma, we know so much of that is around environmental racism. So you're basically telling me if some power company has a coal power plant right next to a school of poor black 8th graders on the south side of Chicago, it's actually a real story, that I can't just take that and shut that down? That we gotta pay them? That's crazy. You should just be able to shut that down, and if you get mad, too bad, too sad. You can't even do things to improve keep kids basically from dying? That's amazing. And kids, and it starts at birth. There's a crazy statistic, I forget what it is now, but something like 30% of women in this country, 10 or 11 years ago, it's probably changed now, had enough mercury in their blood that if they got pregnant, their kids could be born with deformities because of the mercury, and it was almost all coming from coal power plants. So you're telling me you have a situation like that, you gotta pay the person poisoning people? That's deep. Why should we follow that? Why should we do that? But if you go to Congress, that's the whole thing, right? America, 1776, 250 years. We wrote it down. 1787, Hamilton, good musical. It's such a great country, blah, blah, blah. You got to tear it down and rebuild it, which is not that strange. Humans have been around for 100,000 years. And, newsflash, we've changed how we live a lot of different times. It's not like it's actually maybe the most human thing, that you look for ways to evolve and to grow, to be able to do more, to find ways to live with each other in different and more complex ways. That's what we do as humans. We grow and we evolve. And it seems like we can't grow and evolve out of a system that tells us, because of some words written by a slave owner in 1787, I can't shut down a coal power plant that's poisoning my community. What are we doing? We have to be able to change and to do things like that. So let me just stop here because I know we're supposed to close. But thank y'all so much. I appreciate folks coming out.